afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the latest episode of Cannabis Unlocked. Today, I'm very excited to be joined by my friend Aaron Miles, the CIO of Verano. Aaron, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great, Jordan. Thanks for having me on. Excited to be here.
Absolutely excited to have you. Been a very exciting last several weeks in the cannabis industry. Never a dull moment to be sure. But before we get into that, would love to hear a little bit about your background, both personally and professionally, and how you ended up getting into the cannabis industry.
Yeah, it's actually quite an interesting story. I was working at Tribune Publishing, and that's for a whole other conversation, but they were going through some shakeup in the C-suite, and I knew my position was going to be eliminated. And so I was kind of looking for a job. And I was going to take a role down at Pier One Imports down in Fort Worth, Texas, and I was in the process of negotiating the contract. And my wife and I took a trip to Italy to celebrate my 40th. And out of nowhere, I got a random text message saying, "Would you ever consider taking a cannabis company public?" And I said, "No way." I slammed my phone down. I knew nothing about cannabis at the time, and I started to do a little bit more research and started to see the opportunity and the projections and Pier One Imports and corporate was always going to be there, and this was just an opportunity for me to really step into a startup space, but that had just massive potential. And so I ended up working at starting out at Cresco Labs and help take them public in November of 2018. So it was really just kind of a connection of mine. Just saw this opening and somebody had reached out and as stressful as this industry is, I don't regret the move ever, right? Because this is such a highly dynamic industry, and there's just so much opportunity here. But so I went there, and then kind of fast forward a little bit. I loved working at Cresco, and Charlie and those guys are absolutely amazing over there. I met George Arcos and the former CFO Brian Ward, and he pinged me to have coffee. I heard rumors of him going public and all the other, it's a very incestuous world we operate in. So I heard all the rumors and I was very almost like attracted to the role, right? Because George, gives his employees a lot of autonomy. He expects a lot out of us. And it was just an opportunity for me to take on a much bigger role and kind of round two of going public. And my wife thought I was nuts, but here we are. And fast forward, I feel like Verano is one of the best positioned tier one MSOs, with 158 dispensaries, 13 states that we operate in, 1.1 million square feet of cultivation. And I'm really excited about what we're doing, and I'm excited about the opportunities in the space here. So.
Absolutely. And I'd love to get your perspective on taking two cannabis businesses public. For folks who aren't as deep in the weeds on the industry, there's certainly a lot of idiosyncrasies with running public companies in cannabis that similarly sized businesses in other industries don't have to deal with. So I'd love to get your perspective on what that's been like.
Yeah, I mean, imagine going public. Well, I guess here's the story. So, when we were at Cresco Labs, we were all locked and loaded, dotting the I's, crossing the T's, and the CFO came in my office and was like, "Who's our transfer agent?" And I'm like, "Well, Computer Share. We'll just go to Computer Share." So I call my contact up because I've been in, capital markets for 20 years, and yeah, we can't be your transfer agent. And then you have that oh shit moment. You're like, so what do we do? And so in the cannabis space, you had to get very creative on who you would partner with. And we're very appreciative of Odyssey. Jenna Kay and the team up there are phenomenal in Canada and kind of came in to save the day. But so when you're going public and you don't have all the available resources to you, you have to be very strategic with your, with the way that you go public there. And so and it hasn't really changed. I mean, in cannabis, banking obviously we know is limited, and the banks that you can actually use to help kind of go public are limited as well. And so, from Cresco, you learn a lot. You have to Google a lot of terminology. It was the first time I've ever done a reverse takeover transaction. They went through Randsburg International, gold. And for those that don't know, basically it's like these defunct mining companies, metal companies, and they're just a shell. They're still public. They're not making money, but they're looking for an exit strategy. And it's a really nice partnership because they quote unquote acquire us. Both entities go under, and then you kind of reemerge as a Canadian-based, corporation. And so it was a quick way to get into the Canadian capital markets. And again, Richard Carlton and those guys up the CSE allowed us to list and really use our stock as currency. So, what you learn, is how to become more efficient, when you're going through it the second time. And it's amazing, even though I've been through that, there was just still so much scrambling and still so much last minute trying to figure things out just because it's just such a highly dynamic industry. And a lot of times too, it's like you find like a Haywood Securities that can house a lot of shares, and John Kirk and those guys have been amazing to help us out, kind of housing our shares. But we were going to use a different firm, and all the early round shareholders had already set up accounts, and then at the last second they were like, well, we're not getting clearing from X bank anymore, so we can't house cannabis shares. And so literally you have to reverse course and try to find a new bank. And so you just have to understand that even if you carve out a definitive path, it might not end up being the path that you walk down. And you
Mhm.
have to be very nimble and flexible in going public twice. And so I can tell you, I think I'm pretty resilient to go through two of those. And, obviously here I am still breathing and kicking, but, it's quite the experience. But a number three for me is probably not in the books. So.
Yeah. And having to list on the CSC has I think really hamstrung the industry's ability to attract institutional investment dollars. So I'd love to get your thoughts on what you think it would require, either A, for them to be able to institutions to start being able to invest more holistically in CSC securities, or to be able to uplist to major US exchanges.
Yeah, so what we did, taking a step back, is we basically moved our shares to the SIBO, which is a
Mhm.
senior exchange, which was the old Neo exchange in Canada. And what that was going to do for us was give us MSCI index inclusion, and they're still obviously in the evaluation process of cannabis stocks. But I would say to attract institutions, they just need certainty around regulation. And a lot of these institutions, I used to work for the New York Stock Exchange. There's nothing in the bylaws that say they can't list us. They choose not to list us because there's zero risk. Well, you start to look at the Wellingtons and the T Rows and those types of big institutions. The reward isn't worth the risk that they would have to take on in the cannabis space right now. And so for them, they need certainty that not only would reclassification help, right? Schedule 3, we obviously have heard the rumors of Schedule 3 happening, but they would probably need some type of certainty around anti-money laundering protections or some type of banking protections. Now, the good news is there are kind of like there's like these intermediary institutions that are like, we just need the government to start making moves towards, legalizing or allowing cannabis to operate like a legal business. And Schedule 3 might alleviate those concerns where you could probably start getting a little bit more of the mid-tier institutions in. But we're having those conversations and we're still treating them like they can invest. And anybody who wants to talk to me, I will talk to them all day long about cannabis and what this opportunity looks like. But it's going to have to be certainty from the government.
Sure. And on that note, a couple years ago, y'all had changed your domicile to British Columbia. Now you're moving it back to the U.S. and Nevada. I'm curious if the outlook for rescheduling has driven any of that, or what drove the jurisdiction change.
I think the biggest thing is just, we wanted to align our US operations because we are obviously in 13 US states and all our revenue gets generated from the US, kind of with our reporting structure. And I think it's a move that we looked at. Actually taking a step back, I think if we all were to go public again, we probably would look at domiciling in the US and maybe taking a little bit longer to do more of a traditional IPO in Canada. But this was something that I think was always on our to-dos. I think, what we've tried to do as a company is always align ourselves to take advantage of any potential opportunities that present themselves. So I think we've been doing that for years now. The move to the SIBO, I think, was a big move for us. And I think doing something like this allows I don't want to say easier capital markets inclusion, but being a US based company could potentially be a little bit more attractive to some of the US components. But we want to make sure that when opportunities present themselves, that we're not missing out on anything. So I think something like that would probably align with that type of strategy.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
And the industry the last month or so has been receiving a lot of renewed attention from the press and from non-traditional cannabis investors, given the indications from President Trump's administration that rescheduling is likely to move forward. I would love to get your thoughts on your outlook for that timing and how you think that could impact Verano's business if it happens.
Yeah, I think we're just patiently waiting. I mean, obviously, as I said, we've heard all the same, read all the same headlines and heard all the same news, and we just want to be cooperative with the government, if and when, any types of these opportunities present themselves. But I think the biggest thing that we can do as a company and as an industry is just making sure that we're buttoned up, if and when opportunities start to really present themselves. But, we've quantified it in the past. I think, the biggest thing for us with with a potential reclassification would be 280E elimination. We've quantified it as around 80 million dollars a year, which is obviously a massive number for a company of our size. And when you start to think about is there any type of banking that would follow on to that? What does banking look like? Because banking alone could just be a checking account with earning interest, or it could be anti-money laundering protections, which then start to open up some of the exchanges potentially. And so again, we're just making sure that we're not missing out on anything. And so I think the biggest thing that we try to do is not waste any time and
Yeah.
not have to do things in arrears. We try to be very proactive in our approach, and that's where we're at. And I can even say if you look at the way that Verano was built, things like no sale leasebacks, I think we get lumped in with other companies, where people think we have the same kind of financial profile as these other companies, but we don't. And so you think about owning all your real estate unencumbered, what could that mean for potential moves down the line and markets opening up? I mean, we could leverage our real estate footprint pretty easily in comparison to some of our counterparts. But I would say reclassification, predictions are TBD. I mean, it's again, you start to make some type of progress, and then obviously there's tragedies that happened last week that probably deserve more attention than this industry right now, because life means more than cannabis companies making money. But at the end of the day, I'm still positive. I just am cautious in my approach because I've been in this space a long time, and we're very careful. But I can tell you we're not getting too far over our skis. We're not, making too big of bets on the regulatory moves as a company. We're just taking care of our operations, making sure that we're buttoned up, and if and when things start to open up, we're ready to go.
Yeah, absolutely. A lot of PTSD in the industry from getting our hopes up.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's just amazing. I mean, we've gotten, and I won't even give specifics, but like we've gotten calls of certainty like a night before something was supposed to happen, and then you're like listening to a hearing, and you're like, what is going on? Like this is like in less than 12 hours, something changed, right? So you have to be very nimble and flexible, and I think have a massive ability to absorb stress, which I think a lot of these, I'm sure you do and I do. So here we are.
Absolutely. And I think a follow-on effect of Section 280E going away would be that the cost of debt would come down significantly,
Yeah.
right? A, because cannabis businesses have more cash flow to service the debt, and B, because I think it would also drive a lot of lenders into the space that were a little bit too hesitant beforehand. So I'd love to get your thoughts on if you had any additional perspectives there on what rescheduling could mean for the cost of debt and potentially the cost of equity as well.
I mean, if you look at where we're at right now at 6.5 plus prime, and you look at like our profile, I mean, 2023, we generated $73 million of free cash flow, and that was on top of paying $168 million in taxes.
Mhm.
And we're paying nearly 15% rate, on a $350 million term loan. That's massive, right? And so, naturally, you would assume that would come down. I mean, I don't like to make any guarantees, but
Sure.
280E going away, us allowed to bank like just like a normal business, and I think that's the biggest, um, I think highlight that I would want to point out, or kind of clarification, is that all we're looking for as an industry is just to operate like a normal business. That's it. I want to earn interest on the 69 million bucks that we have, in our bank account. And I want to be able to get rates that a company of our similar size and status would be able to get. And that's just not happening right now. So I would definitely anticipate that coming down. In the interim, what we're doing though is we're getting really creative on the balance sheet, right? And so what we did in the quarter, we basically made $16 million in prepayments on debt. Part of that was, if you remember, we bought Arizona and two Arizona assets to add to our Arizona footprint, but we also had entry into Virginia through the cannabis asset or for acquisition. And part of that was a seller's note. And so we were able to retire a portion of that at 75% of face value to save about 4 million bucks. So even though rates aren't necessarily where we want it to be, there's things that we can do to strengthen the balance sheet. And I can tell you, our debt comes due in October of 26. And as we said on our earnings call, like we're having very productive conversations, but we also kind of have a little bit of time on our side right now, like in kind of wait to see, because what happens if bigger announcements and bigger news comes out, it's kind of yet to be determined here. But I like where we're at. But yes, I would absolutely anticipate cost of debt coming down.
Absolutely. And have you heard any guidance as to what would happen with both any unpaid 280E liabilities from prior years and or refunds for that those taxes paid in prior years?
Yeah, I think it's kind of another TBD, right? I mean,
Mhm.
I think we have taken a similar stance. A couple quarters ago, we highlighted on our earnings call that, we were going to file the UTP, and we are a normal taxpayer. So we're going to, we pay our, we made $26 million of tax payments in Q2. And so we are normal taxpayers at the federal level. We've always been at the state level. But as you start to see more states kind of decouple, I think that put a little bit of pressure on the federal government. But it's kind of to be determined what happens with these UTP positions. But I think we have time on that, and plenty of time to work with the government to see how that looks. But for now,
Absolutely.
normal taxpayer, and obviously we'll continue to kind of implement that strategy from a UTP perspective.
Great. So shifting gears a bit, you mentioned the cannabis transaction that you executed last year, which I definitely want to double click on. But first, I would just love your broader perspectives as the CIO of two of the largest cannabis companies and operating in the industry really since we've had public markets. I would just love your high level thoughts on how you've seen capital markets and M&A markets in cannabis develop over those years.
So it's always very aggressive, right? To me, cannabis kind of reminded me of like biotech, where you would have some smaller companies like create a novel drug, and they would want some of the bigger companies to come in and just buy them out. It was the same thing with some of the footprints in certain states, where you get some of the smaller operators, and they didn't want to operate for the long term. They just wanted to operate and roll into a bigger asset. And so the green rush back in the day, 2018 was a very aggressive year for M&A. And then even into 21, if you look at like Verano, like we executed on 14 acquisitions in 2021, not including the AltMed, which gave us Florida and Arizona. So that would be 15, and we did two in early 2022. So I mean, in that time frame, really from 2018 into early 22, I think the market as a whole was very fluid, and it was very aggressive. I think what you're starting to see is pricing start to rationalize a little bit. I know certain companies in 2018 were going out public at like 30 to 40 times, and like we went public at 8 times in 2021. And so when you start to think about some of the crazy valuations that were being thrown out in the early days, I feel like we're becoming more of an established market. And that's why I think you're starting to see M&A start to slow down a little bit. I'm not going to come meet with you and then 24 hours later we're going to have an agreement, a handshake, and then a month later we're into definitive agreements. We're now, I think, acting and rightfully so as real companies, right? And so we're
Yeah.
taking our time, we're evaluating, and we're just going to pounce on opportunities when we can. But we've been a leader in this space from an M&A perspective. We're not shy to make a deal, and we, the Virginia, Arizona assets were phenomenal. The cannabis team, Jesse Chan and those guys were absolutely amazing to work with. And so, but it was just, there was an opportunity for them, and they needed cash. And it was an opportunity for us. We wanted Virginia and Arizona. And so it just happened to work out, very well. But I think you're going to see M&A as of right now just kind of stay in this kind of slow state. And then
Mhm.
I think you'll start to see some pickup if we get any movement at the federal level, and stock starts to become more valuable. Because how do you pay for these deals, right? I
Right.
can't dilute the stock crazy right now. I mean, cash is king, so you have to get very creative on how you would structure things. And I think I just think it's an interesting time. I think right now it's kind of a slowdown, but I think you'll start to see things accelerate here in the near term.
Yeah, I totally agree.
Yeah.
And it also seems like with the deteriorating capital markets over the last few years, that the bid ask spread has really narrowed between buyers and sellers.
Yeah, yeah, it's crazy. Yeah, I was just talking about this a couple weeks ago, where some of the asks from some of these smaller operators is just like they just haven't changed. If anything, their idea of what the company is worth has actually accelerated and not come down with how you'd see like a normal market. And one thing that I touched on is like sometimes it's easier to work on a bigger deal than it is kind of like the mom and pop shit, mom and pop shops, because you're starting to deal with emotion and you just don't put a multiple on emotion. Like you do a pure fundamental analysis on the business, and the markets are compressed right now and pricing has come down. And so if people want to be very realistic, like we'll have those conversations. But I do think you're starting to see that tighten a little bit. I think you're starting to see people rationalize, kind of their ideas and what they could get for certain businesses, but not as much as I would have anticipated at this point.
Yeah, that makes sense. And speaking of Arizona and Virginia, would love to get your thoughts on what was attractive to you about those markets.
So Arizona, we as part of it was, a multiple acquisition for us back in 2021, but we had entrance into Florida and basically established a very large footprint in through the AltMed transaction. And ever since then, we've done more deals in Arizona to build up our footprint there, and we see an opportunity to go deeper in that state
Mhm.
and really start to grab market share. So we were always looking for some Arizona assets, and in Virginia, I mean, you know that market, one of five HSAs, especially when only four are running in the state, ahead of what we would anticipate adult use turning on, is extremely attractive. And we're down in Virginia Beach. It's a high population area. It's also a high vacation area. So when you think about what an adult use turn on in that state could look like, it was very attractive for us. And it's also a high margin state because kind of what we grow, we would sell through the six dispensaries that we have open. And so I think Virginia was always on our radar, but early stages, it was just, prices were astronomical and we didn't want to get in bidding wars. And this opportunity presented itself and we took advantage of it. And here we are. Now we have a Virginia asset. Integration has been going tremendously well. And I would say if you think about what an adult use turn on in that state could look like, think kind of early days New Jersey. I mean, when there was only 13 adult use stores open, I mean, that was massive for our business. And Virginia could be very similar to a turn on like that. So.
Yeah, absolutely. And two of the big issues that all the operators have been facing over the last several years include price compression as well as tightening of accounts receivable. And so I would love to hear your thoughts on how you've been able to manage both of those.
Yeah, you had to dig your heels in the
Yep.
sand here, and we were the first mover to do that. Where we said, if you're not paying us money, we're not going to give you product. Well, when other people aren't shutting accounts off, they said, well, fine, we'll just go to these other accounts. And I think this last quarter, if you really go in and look at the AR balances for some of these other companies, you can see that people are also starting to dig their heels in, and so that was a necessary step for the industry. Nothing we worked on with obviously other companies. We can only do what Verano is able to do. But you're now starting to see us start to turn back on some accounts, and you're not going to do that at 100%. You're going to start them off slowly, make sure they're paying their bills, and if they do that, then you can slowly start to ramp up. But they know that we can shut that account off because we were getting calls. Well, I got to get product for my dispensary, and we're like, yeah, we also have a business to run, and so you're supposed to pay your bills. And so I think you could see our AR balance went down 9 million last quarter. And again, I think as an industry, I think we're doing a better job at holding people accountable. And
Mhm.
then from a pricing perspective, I mean that the compression is real. I mean, our wholesale was down in the quarter. We did $202 million on the top line, and retail was up, wholesale was down, but we were selling into more accounts.
Mhm.
So, you start to look at that. That's the good news. More people are using cannabis. That's the good news. More product categories are out there, and more people are using, cannabis than ever before. And then you're starting to look at like really tough comps year over year because of that pricing. But I think if you start to get, some rationalization in some markets take a while to normalize. that does start to level out. But as I said, the good news is that we're selling into more accounts, and I think our strategy really has paid some dividends right now. So.
Yeah, absolutely. And how about with regards to price compression? How much would you say of that has been driven by intoxicating hemp competition versus more regulated competition versus just inflation hitting consumers?
Yeah, I think it's probably a combination of all, but I would say more than anything else, early stages was probably an oversupply in the market. And people who probably went to business school and had an economics class, and they're like, okay, I'm going to lower my prices and grab market share, and then that market share is going to stay. That just doesn't happen in this industry, right? And so I think oversupply in the markets, especially in the early days, was to the detriment of pricing, and I think you're starting to see that normalize a little bit. And I just think in certain states, like you look at like a Pennsylvania, they're the state has just not turned on adult use, and that market keeps preparing for an adult use turn on, and there's so much supply in that market that you start to feel that pricing impact pretty strongly. And really, from the intoxicating hemp, I mean, I think that's taken sales away from us. I don't think it's necessarily hurt from a pricing perspective per se, because if you went to New York, and you walked into some of those bodegas and you walk into gas stations. I mean, sales in those outside of the legal cannabis chain has been strong, and I mean to the tune of billions of dollars. And so if you can get some type of regulation on that, I think Mitch McConnell back in the day was trying to help his tobacco buddies and pass the farm bill. Great, but I don't think they realized what would actually end up happening here. So there's been a real impact to our industry. But I would say it's probably more legal cannabis supply related than anything else, and people probably getting too aggressive. I mean, you had Trulieve acquire Harvest, and they had to get rid of some of the supply as per the Florida regulation. That started a lot of I think pricing competition in the state, and I think that's kind of continued. We haven't discounted as much as others, but I think discounting has definitely impacted pricing. So.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
And speaking of Florida, what is your outlook for that state? Obviously, your biggest dispensary count in the footprint. So, yeah, how do you feel about the prospects for Florida?
Right. Well, we just opened up number 82. I think
Congrats.
Florida is the state that we've definitely been positioning for. We had some people concerned last year when they saw some of that OMMU data showing that we were kind of falling from a market share perspective, but that was all a very calculated and purposeful move. Apollo Beach is a massive facility for us, 220,000 square feet, and we went from a single to a double stack in a lot of the rooms that were down there, and that takes time to implement that. That takes time to get product back out into the market. So you can see now that we are clearly the very strong number two in the state,
Mhm.
and we're going to continue to position ahead of what we think is going to be a very positive new administration coming in. I think the thing that we're doing different as an industry now is that we're actually working with potential incumbents
Mhm.
early on, trying to get a feel for what cannabis looks like, and thoughts on cannabis. And instead of always being reactive and playing catch up like we had to do at the federal level, I
Mhm.
think on the state level, we're starting to get a little bit more proactive. So that said, I mean, last year, I'm kind of contradicting myself saying we don't make business bets on regulatory moves, but in Florida we did. And we bought a third facility, and we pumped tens of millions of dollars into this facility, which was tough pill to swallow. But the good news is that we did that. So now you're sitting on that investment, and you're sitting on the number two position in Florida. And if and when that market does turn to adult use, we're going to be really ready to take advantage of that. And the people are calling for it. There's almost 700,000 signatures to get it on the ballot, and so people want adult use in the state of Florida. We hit 56% in the ballot, and luckily DeSantis, put that initiative in place that it needed 60%. And the irony is the 60% didn't even get 60% when it passed. So it's just, it's like one of these things where politics are at play here. But we're very positive on Florida and well positioned. And the good news is that we've done this in multiple states. Like we were the leader in Illinois when that transitioned over to adult use. New Jersey, Connecticut, Maryland, Ohio. Like, I mean, we've done this multiple times, transitioning from medical to adult use. And Florida, VA, and PA. I mean, we're going to be a leader in those states as well in that transition.
Yeah, that makes sense. And how would you feel about the competition from hemp in Florida and beyond? And do you have a perspective on what you would like to see from a regulatory perspective to help even the playing field with the legal THC market?
I mean, sure. It's a real impact to the market. I've seen studies just from, Texas alone. They've obviously been making headlines from the hemp perspective, but that market alone has been quantified at $2 to $4 billion just in Texas alone, right? And so you start to think about what would that look like if all of that went back through a legal channel. Granted, Texas hasn't passed a cannabis program yet, but you start to look at other states, and you start to look at how much hemp is available. And you start to see what that opportunity could look like if some of that went back to the legal channels. Now, what would I be looking for is an even playing field, right? Like the licensing, the regulation, the testing of products, no pesticides, seed to sale monitoring. If you're going to allow intoxicating hemp into the market, well, at least allow it to be regulated in the same way. And ideally, what I think, and you've read reports on this as well, and this is not my prediction, but ideally, if you could maybe push some of the flower and edibles back into the cannabis channels, which I think is a lot safer for consumers. I think beverages will probably have a carve out at some point, from a hemp perspective. But I would say what I would look for is just a level playing field. Like what we have to do and the money we have to pay for licensing and regulation and product testing, and it's not the same on the other side. And to be honest, it's a much more dangerous product because it isn't
Totally.
regulated and tested, and you're starting to see some people, kind of some headlines being made with some people who've probably consumed some bad hemp products. And at the end of the day, that could hurt the cannabis product because people don't know how to decipher between the two industries, right? And so I think just pushing some of that back through the legal channels is ideally what I would be looking for. But I think initially is just regulate that the same way that you would regulate the cannabis, and that would naturally take those products off the shelf because I can guarantee you a massive amount of those products would not meet the standards or the testing requirements.
Yeah, makes sense. And I think a big part of the reason that capital markets have been so tight the last few years is that a lot of money was invested, and to your point about oversupply, frankly, overbuilt on the hopes that federal legalization would happen very quickly following the blue wave election of 2020. And then that obviously didn't happen. Now we've got a Republican administration in who historically the leadership has not been, I'd say, as supportive of cannabis as the Dems. Yet it seems like the base at this point, by and large, supports it. Obviously, President Trump sent his support for rescheduling before the election. But we've also seen a number of prominent Republican influencers highlight that they view cannabis to be too potent, right? Or that they're seeing young folks getting addicted to it, or they're seeing too much consumption in public places, and they don't like the impact on the community. And I think there's validity to all those arguments. So I'd love to get your thoughts on what would be the best way to build a bridge across all those different demographics that have supported the Trump administration, and how we can address those concerns with a more legal and accessible cannabis industry going forward.
I think cannabis is one of the rare industries that can kind of bridge the gap between the left and the right. Because, if you start to look at clemencies and righting a lot of the wrongs of people, being incarcerated for low levels of cannabis offenses, look at Weldon Angelos, Mission Green Project, we partner with him. I mean, he was in prison for 13 years for $900 worth of cannabis. And it's just insane to me when you start to think about how demonized this product has actually been. And it's all about, at the end of the day, it's about who in DC, and it's what incentives are you putting out there for DC. I mean, you're talking about concerns over a product, but you also have government that allows tobacco to still be on the shelves, and there's zero medicinal benefits. I mean, it's just going to lead to lung cancer, or mouth cancer. It's like, and so, it's kind of laughable at times when people say, we're really concerned about, the effects of what this product can look like. And so it's on us to educate. It's on us to make sure people understand that there is a massive medicinal component to this. There is a massive recreational component to this, but everything has to be used responsibly. I mean, alcohol the same way. I mean, I have pushed the limits. I'm sure a lot of people that are going to watch this have pushed the limits with alcohol, but you have to drink responsibly. And it's the same thing with cannabis is, people have to learn how to use this product responsibly. So I think when you actually talk about the benefits of, more states that legalize, the less the cartel sends, cannabis across the borders, that's shown to actually have an impact on sex trafficking. This speaks to what that administration is looking for. And you start to think about jobs and job creation. What would 50 companies going public in the US look like right now for the US capital markets? And again, we have $69 million on the balance sheet. You add up everybody, all the cash on the balance sheets, and you put that in the federal banking system and start to look at interest. And, we can't do anything from, derivatives and commodities and this and all. Like, it's like nothing is open to us. And so when you actually look at the benefit, not only just from a economic perspective, but from a medicinal perspective. My uncle David was an Army Ranger and hurt his back, and I mean, this is a rinse and repeat story, but addicted to opiates, and moved, literally died from an overdose. And you look at someone like him who didn't have the ability to even understand what cannabis could do for him, right? And so if this has the potential to save lives, then we need to explore this. And I think this administration and the government folks are starting to understand that. But the war on drugs is real. Like, I even know me, like in 2018, I talked to my brother. I'm like, should I be taking a job in cannabis? And what about my reputation? And I don't know anything about cannabis. And am I gonna go crazy if I ever eat an edible? Like, and it's literally all that's ingrained into your mind. But when you actually start looking at the research and the actual facts and figures of what this product can do, that's on us to educate people. And I think we're doing a much, much better job at coordinating as an industry and educating, different regulators. But there's also going to be a bias no matter what, right?
Mhm.
There's politicians that have been, they have heavy lobbying from the hemp industry, so they're naturally going to be anti-cannabis. You have alcohol and tobacco, not necessarily tobacco, it's more alcohol, pharma, a few other of the industries that are like very anti-cannabis, because if we do get legalized, you can see the reports. I mean, I saw a report that is, said pharma would be impacted by $7 to $9 billion if
Wow.
cannabis gets legalized. Well, I'm pretty sure Pfizer's not like, hey, we want everyone to go spark up a joint. We want you to be on XYZ, medication. And so, again, it's trying to, you're trying to thread the needle here where you're like, there is a place in this world for all of us to coexist. Pharma can still exist. Cannabis can be legalized. We can use it as a, medical research. We can help with PTSD and veterans and, pain management for cancer patients. I mean, and so people understanding that this isn't just Cheech and Chong, this is also a massive, research and medicinal component that can come into those markets. And then you say, okay, from an economic perspective, there's also a big opportunity here. But it takes time, and people's minds change quickly, on the hill, and so that's why we just have to keep on keeping on, right? So
Totally. Yeah. And I think a lot of the points you bring up are so poignant and relevant for everything going on right now, where it feels like we're really at this broader reassessment of our approach to healthcare, of what we've labeled as drugs versus medicine, our approach to food. And one of the subsectors that's clearly in a stage of transformation is the psychedelic space, right? And I think that's another place where there's clearly medical benefits. There's also clearly risks. So don't want to say that there's no harm potential by any means. But I would just love to get your perspective on the parallels you may see between what's going on with cannabis and what's going on with psychedelics.
yeah, I mean, psychedelics, I would even just say, personally have been game changing for me, right? And again, you're talking to somebody who didn't know the difference between indica and sativa before starting in the cannabis space, and you start to see non-traditional means of mental health and just healthcare in general, right? And so I think psychedelics is a massive component. And let me do the caveat here, nothing that Verano is associated with, right? Like, we haven't gone down the psychedelic path and we're not looking at anything like that. But when you look at the parallels between the two, right? When you can go from this is a drug to this is a medicine, now you're onto something, right? Because again, we've touched on the cannabis thing, where it's a very safe drug. I mean, tell me how many ODs from cannabis there are, on an annual basis. It's zero. from cannabis alone. And so when you actually look at the power of these medicines, it's really mind blowing. And so from the psychedelic perspective, I think you're starting to see like HHS recommended, psilocybin being reclassified to a Schedule 3. I think psilocybin is going to be kind of like a standout medicine. And I think when you look at psychedelics, there's definitely like microdosing. I think people are always going to use them recreationally. I would love to see a survey of when you go to a Dead concert at the Sphere. What's the mix of quote unquote medicine that's there, but I do think psychedelics truly have that medicinal component, right? And so you look at like psychedelics, like psilocybin, where they can be just so transformational. And I think the thing that scares, like the pharma industry is that they can be so transformational, so like in such a short amount of time. And the biggest thing that I've looked at when it comes to the psychedelic space is, you have to be very careful, do your education. If you are leaning into this space, definitely have, a really trusted guide that can help you kind of step in. But I mean, from a mental health perspective, PTSD, substance abuse, mental illness, palliative care. I mean, psilocybin back in the day was being researched because of cancer patients that were nearing death. It actually gave them comfort with crossing over or dying. And so for me, it really hits home. My wife, Steph, has 3 medical degrees. She's a nurse anesthesiologist, and she had, this has meant so much to her and me too. But that she was part of the Changa Institute, the first licensed facilitators program in Colorado. And we're going to be opening up at some point a legal, trauma focused, medically oriented. Healing center called Canoe, Knew. But this is all for the healing of everyone that's around. And it just, I can't even say enough of it, right? Because I mean, I know I would love to get your thoughts on the psychedelic space too. But when you actually think about what this can do from just a mental health perspective, it's game changing. And so I just hope more people can lean in to the psychedelic space. But again, you're going to want to do it with trained professionals, people who really know what they're doing, because there's a lot of potency and a lot of power to these medicines. And they're uh, effective for a reason, and it's because of the power of all of these. So, but yeah, I'd love to get your thoughts too, because I do think there's a lot of crossover between the two spaces, and I don't think cannabis and psychedelics will ever dance in the same arena, but what they're trying to accomplish, I feel, is very similar. So,
Yeah. Yeah, I totally agree. And my whole perspective on psychedelics, similar to yours, right, was definitely opened up first by being in the cannabis industry, but also after moving to Colorado, it's just always been a very psychedelics forward state. And so less of a stigma, I'd say, associated to it here than in most places. And my first experiences with them were more, I'd say, recreational focus. So, enjoyable, but not necessarily life changing. But the more that I started to explore spirituality, just from from the scriptures perspective, the more I could see parallels in those experiences with what I was learning about, right? And then I had a pretty transformational experience of ego dissolution a few years ago that just really shifted my perspective on everything. So I've definitely seen in my own life the benefits that they can provide. I've certainly seen too that in the wrong setting for folks, it can not be a good substance at all. So to your point, I think having the right facilitators and the right spaces to work with them is critically important. But I'm very encouraged by it. I think similar to your point about big pharma, they I think are very scared of the industry and are certainly fighting back against it because they see how folks using psychedelics appropriately can deal with a lot of the mental health issues that in the past has forced them to be on SSRIs or opiates or whatever it may be for a lifetime subscription. So I don't think that we're without challenges from the incumbents in the space, but I'm really excited about it. I think it's part of this broader transformation we're seeing amongst the populace, right? Where people are recognizing that what's been marketed as capitalism has not has not functioned as a free market capitalist society, and that we really need to reevaluate where our society has placed its focus.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree. And I had a very similar experience about 2.5 years ago where, I just didn't feel okay. And it, I didn't have anything diagnosed. I didn't have anything wrong with me, but like it was just hard to get out of bed and it was just hard to face the day. And my entire life it was like, I've always excelled in things that I've done. And finally I started losing like that momentum and I didn't know what was wrong. And it was just stress. It was anxiety. It was depression. It was, I think my ego at times, like, it can get in the way. And there's this book, Ego is the Enemy by this guy, Ryan Holiday. And it's a beautiful book where he talks about, like how silence is golden. And when you actually eliminate your ego, you become more powerful in the role that you're in. But, the ego tells you that the ego is needed and it's kind of this like vicious circle where you and I are in a meeting and I need to overshadow you because I need my voice to be heard. And what psychedelics have really done for me is it's allowed me to, really at times my ego still surges, and I'm sure you still feel the same thing. But like, when you go through that massive ego death, and psychedelics are, are there's certain ones that can be very powerful in that you realize how beautiful life can actually be and how easy life can be. And it doesn't have to be stressful, but there's no guarantees in any of this stuff. But for me, it's been it almost is like it gives you hope, right? Like you have that moment of clarity during some of these journeys where you're just like, I feel like I actually just have hope, where I just love living life. And instead of like taking a pharmaceutical that just kind of numbs or kind of treats the symptoms but doesn't necessarily get to the core. The psychedelic world for me has been almost a microscope into your soul to be actually really find out who you are. And it can help you from, a physical perspective, mental perspective, spiritual perspective. I mean, there's so many different layers that this can touch on that pharmaceuticals just can't. And I think what they're trying to do is delay and slow down that process so they can catch up and create synthetic versions of this because they're like, well, we need to be able to make money and all this stuff. But as I said, I mean, this is the thing that me and my wife are doing. This is the first time that I'm ever doing anything where it's like I don't care about the money aspect of it. Obviously you're going to want to break even and make sure that you're soluble, but like this is all about healing and this is about spreading that word and making sure so many more people can feel that hope, right? Because life can be tough and it doesn't need to be. And so I think to your point, I think there's just so much potential with this space. So
That's awesome. So Aaron, I think in the next few months, we're hopefully going to have a lot of new interest from retail as well as institutional investors in the space. And so for folks who are coming up to speed on the cannabis industry and the different MSOs, what would be your sales pitches to why Verano uh, is separated from the rest of the pack? And I think you touched on obviously the fact that you don't have any sale leasebacks. I can attest to the fact that you guys are super well known throughout the industry on your operational excellence. But I would just love your perspective on why folks should pick Verano over the rest of the pack.
yeah, we're just, Verano's just built differently. We've been a leader from the get-go. And that is driven by George Arcos. I mean, he's an operator, he's a business owner. He didn't ever have to figure out how to run a business. He knew how to run a business. And if you look at comparisons to other founders, more legal backgrounds, more banking backgrounds, George was like, I can hire a lawyer, but I know how to run a business. And so the no sale leaseback thing, I think gets overlooked a lot. I don't think people really understand what encumbered real estate looks like and how expensive those sale leasebacks were back in the day. And I mean, you're talking, 20% on certain facilities with escalators and they go out 15 years. And so that was a big kind of outlier for us. But, the way that George built the business as well as he said, we are going to fund this business off of cash flow. And so early stages, it was never like profitability is going to catch up with us down the line. And you've seen a lot of companies kind of fall victim to that. We've always been a leader and from a margin perspective, cash flow perspective, and it's the way that we run this business so efficiently. So I would say, from a footprint perspective, I would put our footprint up against anybody. And especially when you look at, the adult use transactions that have already happened compared to the ones that are about to happen. We quantified Florida last year. If it flipped on, that could be an additional $300 to $450 million on the top line just alone from one state.
Wow.
And yeah, so we're positioned well in that state. Virginia, we've talked about, obviously, high traffic area down in Virginia Beach that we feel would be very beneficial to us from an adult use turn on. And PA, we have 18 dispensaries. We have a big cultivation in PA, so we're ready for that transition. And so I would say, why Verano? It's because we're a proven commodity. We're proven from the bottom line. We're proven, from the way that we run the business. And, there's been, some overhangs on the stock. We have the Vireo lawsuit, which, we touched on the call, which, I think, overall is, the frivolous lawsuit, $1 billion was, put into a lawsuit last year, and it definitely has had an impact to us. And synopsis real quick, we've gone through the discovery process, and we feel that we had 4 termination rights in our agreement, and so we feel really strong about our stance in the case, and more to come on that one. And as we get through the discovery process, there'll probably be additional damages that we'll put out there, but that has been an overhang on the stock. But outside of that, the company is just very fluid. And so what makes Verano, different? It's the way that we're built. It's the way that we operate the business. It's the efficiencies that we have throughout the business. And we're doing small moves of moving to a senior exchange like SIBO. We're redomiciling the business, or working to redomicile the business. And we've always been positioning ahead of capital markets. So Verano is built to last, and will be around for quite some time. And I'm really excited about what we're doing here.
Awesome. Well, Aaron, thank you so much for joining the show today. This has been such a fun conversation.
Yeah, I love it. Yeah, thank you for having me on, Jordan, and love that we could touch on kind of all aspects of business and even personal. So thanks for having me on today.
Definitely. All right, I'll see you soon.
All right, thank you.